Hi, I'm Paul J., and welcome to the theAnalysis.news podcast. This episode is produced in collaboration with Other News. Other News is an international press platform that disseminates analysis, insights, and information about global issues in English, Spanish, and Italian. You can find it at other-news.info. Poland is one of the more important countries of Europe in terms of geopolitics and the size of its economy. Yet in North America, we hear very little about it, and most of us know even less. Poland is a regional power in Central Europe with the largest stock exchange in the East Central European zone, has the sixth largest economy in the European Union and 10th largest in all of Europe. Poland maintains a high-income economy, along with a relatively high standard of living. At least that's what it says when you research Poland. We're going to find out how true all that is. It has, relatively speaking, high living standards and does well in terms of standards of safety and education. Alongside a developed educational system, the state also provides free university education, social security, and a universal healthcare system, none of which you can find in the United States. Poland is one of the closest allies of the U.S. in the world, contributing troops to the invasion of Iraq and supporting the U.S. policy of encirclement of Russia. Now joining us to discuss the situation in Poland and its role in the world is Boyan Stanislavski. He's a Bulgarian and Polish activist, a journalist, an editor, publisher, translator. In the late 90s, he was active in the Polish left and later in the labor movement, particularly the biggest Polish labor confederation, the All Poland Trade Union Alliance. Until 2012, editor-in-chief of its weekly magazine, and senior editor at barricada.org and strike.eu. He's the Polish correspondent for the Bulgarian National Radio. Thanks for joining us, Boyan.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't we start with what's in the news and then get sort of to the bigger picture. Poland has a very right-wing, almost virtually fundamentalist Catholic government. And there's been very brutal suppression of the LGBTQ community recently. So tell us, first of all, what's been happening and why, and where is Polish public opinion on this?
Absolutely. What we're witnessing in Poland right now is a major crackdown on the LGBTQ community here, a violent one on top of that. And it bears no resemblance to anything that I can think of in the modern Polish history since, homosexuality was not outlawed anymore. And that happened in the early 30s. This is, of course, abhorring because we see a lot of, or we saw a lot of politically motivated police violence against the LGBTQ activists and their supporters. The events that surfaced in the international media that happened last weekend and I don't want to go into all the details of it, but it was rampant police violence in the very center of Warsaw, Polish capital, where people were not only beaten up, dragged on the concrete to police cars, massively arrested. I mean, I think even the police, they even went over the top in a way that there was not enough room in all the police stations in Warsaw. They had to drive them, the detainees, to police stations in small towns.
How many people were involved in the protests?
Well, the protest wasn't massive. It was about a couple of hundred people, and a little more than 100 were detained. Afterwards, it turned out that almost 50 were arrested effectively. And all of them, at least I haven't seen any account where anyone would say that their rights or that as detainees or arrested citizens would have been respected. So that's why I say all of them were subjected to either minor or major tortures, including sexual harassment. There were some absolutely hair-raising reports in the social media, as well as in the mainstream oppositional media and in alternative media, about how particularly transgender people that were arrested were, stripped of their clothing on under some sort of very weird pretext that, some personal search has to be conducted, and, their genitals were touched, they were laughed at, they were, it's really horrendous. And many people were denied contact with lawyer, family. Even MPs, Polish members of parliament who tried to intervene to prevent the police from exercising this rampant brutality were physically assaulted by the police, which to me is a manifestation of the fact that we now have passed the tipping point and we live in an authoritarian state. Because when you have MPs with immunity that are trying to, stand between the repressed people and the police, and they are being pushed down on the concrete and by the police, that means, it was obviously politically motivated. The police were instructed to do so. They were also reassured that there will be complete and total impunity.
So why would the government do this when a couple of hundred people, they could have ignored it? Why choose to make such a spectacle of repression?
Yes, that's because of the nature of this government and the way they perceive politics. For them, politics is not like some conflicting interests in the society or in the economy that one has to solve as a leader, but is rather a kind of constant game of emotional disbalancing and emotional exploitation of society. This is their matrix for their political. This is their political agenda. This is how they work. And because LGBT is such a symbolic thing, and it has the potential of being divisive, that's why they are doing this. And also, it's because of the fact that the leader of the currently ruling party in Poland, Law and Justice, as you said quite rightly in your introduction, a right-wing Catholic fundamentalist party, chairman by the name of Kaczynski, he's a very spiteful and revengeful person. And once LGBT activists attracted some public attention and media attention, including international media, they immediately became enemy number one. And he just had to crack down on them. This is the mentality, also authoritarian mentality, I would say, that is behind this. And of course, they could have ignored it. And in the first place, they didn't have to provoke this, because it was all preceded with a lot of provocative actions on the part of the state against the LGBT community. It finally, brought the people to the center of Warsaw into this sort of a spontaneous demonstration that they recently dismantled in such a brutal manner. So important for them to do that. And I think now, since the Russian card, because they're running out of boogeyman, for the last couple of years, the boogeyman number one were the Russians. Of course, the Russians are coming, the Russian tanks are coming, and all the rest of the story. So that kind of started losing inertia, and they had to come up with something else in order to maintain control over the society, because this is the only way they know how to rule. On the other hand, I want to say that this itself should not be treated as an isolated incident. Or of course, it is an incident, and it's a very violent and horrific one. But this is a symptom of the general disintegration of the Polish society that hasn't started yesterday, not even a year ago, or not even in 1215, when Law and Justice won the parliamentary election and the presidential election for the first time. It's a process that has been going on for the last 3 decades, and it's as long as the Polish restoration of capitalism is. So it all dates back to 1989, really. And it's really strange for the international press to interpret the current events in Poland, not only the one from the last weekend, but in general, what's going on here, as some kind of accident, as like everything was going on, and you said it also in the introduction that in the international press or in the American press, you can read only good things about Poland, or you were able to read only good things until 2015 when law and justice took power, and something happened. What was that? Like, how come suddenly, this right-wing hooliganism and rampage in Poland? Well, the left has been trying to warn. And, myself as a left activist from 1998, me and, my comrades, we have been screaming at the tops of our lungs. We have been crying about where this so-called peaceful transition is actually leading us to. But no one listened because, of course, there was, the restoration of capitalism was accompanied by a major ideological offensive where the bottom line was aggressive anti-communism. So we were just ignored. And we said it many, many times that what is happening in Poland is either going to end up in an authoritarian right-wing regime, or is going to happen, or what is going to happen is a general decline of the statehood. And actually, it turns out we were pretty optimistic, because what happens is, both, not one of these things. Poland as a state is in a state of decline, so to say, a major decline, where the society is totally disintegrated, and the state institutions don't do their job. They are only instruments in the hands of the ruling party, which is not a party anymore. It's like a corporation. It's everywhere. So they are only used for distribution of influence, or for securing power, basically, or for repression. The society at the same time is enormously frustrated, and this is how law and justice came to power, because they decided they're going to actually use it as leverage.
Why this disintegration when what we read, as you say, is mostly good? Like, for example, we're told that Poland missed or didn't have as affected by the crash in 07, 08. Unemployment's relatively low, so on and so on. I mean, what in terms of the economy, what's the real story?
Absolutely. So the real story is that economy shrinked very, very drastically already back in the beginning of the 90s. The restoration of capitalism started with the destruction of the economic backbone of the country, which was the heavy industry, and a total withdrawal of the state from the public sphere in general. What followed was privatization and all forms of, major economic theft, explosion of poverty, mass poverty, something unheard of.
Did it give rise to a class of oligarchs as it did in Russia?
No, not as indeed in Russia. The process was milder. I think it was a little more controlled. Nonetheless, rampant poverty, homelessness, and that was, of course, followed by eruption of criminality, petty criminality, organized crime, pickpockets, gangsters, what have you. And that in turn was followed by how do I explain that? By a cultural decline, civilizational, moral decline in the society, because the society had to be reprogrammed in a way. I mean, people had to start struggling, for their own individual existence. And that had to produce all these pathologies and the growing frustration. So this frustration has been piling up for the last 30 years. And it was allowed to pile up without any major eruption, because there was a certain consensus made around the round table between the old communist, so-called communist party and the opposition. And one of the consensuses was that no matter how hard it is, no matter what hardships the Poles have to go through. We're not giving them anything. No social security, no social benefits, nothing of that kind. And we don't talk about that even. Plus, there was this consensus that we always speak only good things about the transition. Nothing bad can be uttered about it in the public sphere, in the media, and so on and so forth. And then, law and justice, it also has a history. I mean, the leaders of law and justice, the Kaczynski that I mentioned, they have a history in Polish politics. But, to cut the long story short, they were kind of ousted in mid-90s and were functioning somewhere on the periphery of the Polish political system, and they didn't like that. And in 2005, by then they had regrouped and they've won. They made their first big breakthrough by winning the parliamentary elections back then. But the establishment, the previous establishment, was so stable that it managed to kick them out again. And from 2007, they were gathering more and more strength and developing, new ideas about how to, propagate their whatever ideas, views, and so, and what political profile would work best in these situations. And they really, once they won in 2015 again, then they said, we're not letting go. Like, we're not letting it go. This time, we're really, going to stay here for as long as we can, for as long as we can secure a place for us in the Polish establishment. That's why they are so aggressive, because they know that it's the only way for them. And they won because they dared to break the consensuses. It was just the kind of political game in the elite. Like, okay, you play with us that way. You don't allow us to participate in power and like, in the process of power, plus you're not allowing us to be a part of the machine in a way that they could benefit from it as well. So we're going to play some dirty tricks too. And they've broken the consensus.
In my introduction, based on a very cursory piece of research, I said that there is in Poland free university education, social security, and a universal healthcare system. If that's all true, those are all products of a relatively modern European social democracy. So is it true? And if so, then what happened?
Yeah, okay. So absolutely, it's true. And it's not a product of modern European or Western European democracy, social democracy, but it's a product of the Polish People's Republic system. That's what it's a product of. And it's only thanks to very, very severe struggles in the 90s and later, particularly labor union struggles that I participated in, that we managed to keep that. Because, the elite, they wanted to destroy that too. And there were many, many attempts to privatize the healthcare system, to privatize the education, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, in comparison to the economic standards, in the before 1989, this neoliberal experiment that is failing before our very eyes after 30 years, had catastrophic effects on the society and on the economy. So yeah, we managed to keep, battling for that very seriously. Some of the most progressive achievements, social achievements, political achievements, are from before 1989, but most of them were gone. And even if you look at the healthcare or education, in 1966 there was this major campaign in Poland. Build 1,000 schools for the 1,000 years of the existence of the Polish state. That was, and I cannot tell you how many schools they have closed down since 1989, but I'm pretty sure more than 1,000. Plus, I can give you all kinds of indicators, statistically speaking, to make it more, to make it easier to perceive, maybe for our listeners. But only in the
go ahead.
Only in the first 3 years of the so-called transition, 1990 to 1993, 1,500 jobs were liquidated, eliminated from the economy every single day of the year, including Sundays and holidays, statistically speaking, okay, like on average. We had, in 1989, Poland had 31,000 kilometers of railway on which passenger trains operated. Now we have barely 14,000. Okay, so like in terms of hospitals, again, I don't know how many they've closed. I mean, I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but it was a major, major downgrade. Okay, so it's like it's not that the authorities or the powers that be after 1989 have given us free healthcare and free education, but it's the fact that the labor movement struggled against demolishing it to the core, like eliminating it completely. So I hope this gives a sense of what kind of hardships we have been enduring for the last 30 years in Poland and in Eastern Europe in general. And of course, you're right to say that Poland is not like such a failed state, like, for example, Ukraine or Moldova or Bulgaria, for that matter. I know you're going to be speaking with my colleague from Bulgaria sometime later, so he can explain that better. But this is something that produced massive frustration in the society, and it's only that Law and Justice. It's just that Law and Justice took an advantage of it and said, okay, like, we're now going to openly criticize the transition. We're going to say many people have lost during the transition. We're going to say that Poland today, as it is not the best of all worlds for all the citizens. We're going to say, they're going to say all the most basic things that we knew and that we were, trying to inform the public opinion about. But, our access as the left in general to the media and to the public sphere was very, very limited. And it still is limited, of course. But now, with the social media and so on and so forth, things have changed a little bit.
Well, talk about the recent elections. The Law and Justice Party won, but only by about 3 percentage points.
Well, of course, I mean, if you take into it, like, if you want to speak about that mathematically, then if you take all the other parties together and Law and Justice, the Law and Justice won by 3 or 4 or 5% or something like that. I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was less than 10, obviously. So, okay, it wasn't maybe in terms of, mathematically speaking, it wasn't a major success, but like, come on. These were the 6 elections in a row won by Law and Justice. And they were won because it's the first party in the 30 years to the propaganda of which people are able to relate somehow massively. Okay? And of course, the propaganda has to be getting more and more aggressive all the time if propaganda is the only instrument of power that you have. So, it started with some mild social measures. They introduced child support, for example, back in 2016, 500 zloty, about $150 for every child for the parents every month until the children turn 18, I think. So yeah, like, on one hand, they sort of flirted with the people. They said, you're poor, we know you're poor, we're going to give you some money. But, this is about that. Like, they don't do anything else than this. And they are not able to maintain that as well because, they are right-wing, so they don't understand anything about redistribution or progressive taxation and so on and so forth. So they are lowering taxes and expanding expenses at the same time, budgetary expenses. So it's going to flip at a certain point, obviously, and they need the constant stress that they can inflict on the society. They can just spray around the public sphere. And I think this is pretty much what we're witnessing today is pretty much the end of that model that was imposed on Poland in 1989, which is brutal shock therapy-based neoliberalism. But on the other hand, I want to say I'm not very optimistic because judging by the right-wing fundamentalist rampage that is going on in Poland currently, I'm not really sure that what's coming is necessarily better.
In terms of the elections and the overall politics, what's the role of the Catholic Church? Pope Francis himself, and at least his wing of the party, you would think would not be so in support of this kind of repression of LGBTQ and so on. What role does the church play there?
Well, the church is the largest corporation in Poland. It's probably the richest institution in the history of that country. And it's present everywhere, all the time. Even symbolically in terms of architecture, in Warsaw alone, we've got 150 churches, okay? In the very center, we've got over 35. But apart from that, the church has been a part of the transition, and a very important one. And they, back in 1988, so before 1989, 1 year before the roundtable talks and the transition and so on and so forth, the beginning of the transition, they already felt like things are going to change, and they wanted to make sure they're going to be part of the process. So they've started, back then they had launched a hysterical campaign against abortions, because you see, abortions were free and were available for every woman that wanted to have an abortion before 1989. So in 1988, they started this campaign, and they wanted to make sure they were going to be part of the change, okay, of the switch from the previous system to neoliberal capitalism. And of course, they were used as the propaganda ideological wing. They secured that field. They were sort of responsible to format the Polish society ideologically, and they've done a great job from their point of view. Of course, that was not without clear, obvious political support. In 1993, the government, then led by the Prime Minister Hanna Suchocka, from a party that is a predecessor to the party called Civic Platform, the party of Donald Tusk, who's an important figure in the European Union now, and it's a major opposition party now in Poland as well. A right-wing one, just to, I'm stressing on that every time because it's often presented as some kind of liberal democratic, maybe even social democratic organization. That's not true. So back then in 1993, Poland, the Polish government, signed a special treaty with the Vatican where they introduced religion classes, Catholic religion classes, of course, in public schools. When they banned abortion, because abortion is effectively banned in Poland, only there are 3 exceptions. Like if the health of the mother is endangered, if there are some irreversible genetic damages discovered in the fetus, and if rape is involved. Okay, so these 3 circumstances, under these 3 circumstances, you might have a legal abortion, although it's difficult enough to get a legal abortion even in these cases. So from that moment on, not from 1993, but from 1988, actually, the church was gradually expanding its influence and gradually expanding, of course, its wealth. Because let me tell you, it's surprising for many people in the West that, for example, in the 90s, the church, the Catholic Church, as an organization, was allowed to import cars from the West and sell them here without any toll. There were no customs, no toll, nothing. They didn't have to pay anything, okay? And also they barely have to pay until today any taxes. Plus, in 1993, in this document that was signed between the Pope and the Polish Prime Minister back then, there was a huge sum of money in the public budget secured for the church. So every year, every month, every day, we give as citizens, taxpayers, if you like, money, free money to the Catholic Church, which, of course, it's not their only, it's not their only income. They run companies, they run all kinds of travel agencies, stores where they sell, the kind of Catholic decorum, this is just this is a huge corporation.
Right. Let me ask you a question. It's fairly commonly understood amongst people that sort of pay attention to all this that the U.S. directly supported Pope John Paul II becoming Pope and helping facilitate his actions in 1979 and 80. And developing solidarity and so on. I think they're now, have they made him actually a saint at this point, or they're talking about it?
Yeah, it's done.
Yeah, it's done. To what extent is the U.S. still very involved in the outcome of what happens in Poland? And also, what is the Polish government's relationship with Trump? Let's start with the sort of the history of the United States trying to affect the outcome of events.
Yeah, so the United States have been investing, were investing, I should say, in the 80s and in the 70s in all kinds of anti-communist movements throughout Eastern Europe, basically. And, the question of a Polish priest, bishop, whatever, being elected, elevated to this international level, like, becoming a pope, that was very important. And there's a lot of literature about how the United States have, meddled, to use the, word, which is very frequently used now, meddled in this process. And of course, through John Paul II, they were trying to undermine the system and the rule of the Polish United Workers' Party in Poland. And obviously that's 100%. Plus, they've also invested a lot of money through their trade unions, in the Solidarity movement, in the beginning of the 80s and then in late 80s as well. And I think it's also important to understand that the first Solidarity, the one that emerged in the late 70s, was a very serious movement with revolutionary potential, I would say. And then it was destroyed during the years of martial law, 1981, 1983. And then, on the basis of that, like people who were, different people formed the so-called Second Solidarity. That's how it goes in the history books. The Second Solidarity, which had nothing to do with any major social movement. It was just a group of people that wanted to cut a deal with the so-called communists, okay, in inverted commas, communists, to make sure that there's no that they can they will make some space for them to also rule, and that the system is gonna be switched from what we had before to neoliberal capitalism. And Americans were there all the time, and the American and the Polish opposition, they have always been modeling themselves on the Americans. So it's very important, like even culturally, okay, not only politically, but culturally, America was like the model for them. They were constantly looking up towards America. America was like presented here by the opposition as something absolutely fantastic, where people are free, where the shops are full of all kinds of goods, where everybody's rich, and so on and so forth. And you can imagine there was not a lot of talk about like poverty in America, or, for example, lack of healthcare system. Okay, so this dependence, this was translated later on into a sort of kind of geopolitical dependence on the American ruling class, and it lasts until today. And of course, as all the problems, this one also sort of speeded up and gained a lot of inertia during the rule of law and justice, because law and justice, we had all these problems, but law and justice made them more severe in a very short period of time because of their rampant attitude and because of their hooliganism in politics. So, for example, in terms of this bowing to America all the time, they decided they're going to pay 2 billion zlotys. I think it's 500. Something like that. 2 billion zlotys, which is about 500. I'm not sure. I'm getting confused. Billions and billions. Whatever. They're going to pay a huge amount of money for establishing a military base called Fort Trump. So, this symbolically, look at it. It shows you the level of their servitude towards Washington and towards Trump. And because Trump is as he's often described, I don't think this term is very accurate, but a right-wing populist. So they also wanted to be right-wing populists. So they've given a very serious boost to this cultural, counter-revolution that started in 1989 with the church and, turning Poland into a fundamentalist country, basically. So that's why we are seeing, eruptions and outrages almost every week. And they will go like, okay, this week it's LGBT. Some time ago, it was the Russians. 10 years ago, it was Smolensk. Okay, because probably you've heard about the incident in 2010 when a Polish plane, when there was a disaster near Smolensk, and on board Polish plane, 96 officials, including the president of the republic, died in this plane crash in 2010. By the way, the president of Poland at the time was the twin brother of the Kaczynski, who is the leader of Law and Justice Party. So back then they would say, oh, it's the Russians who have killed our president, so on and so forth. Although there were, many international investigations that have proven beyond any doubt that it was a pilot error and so on and so forth. So we had this. Then we had, for example, the theme that we're going to demand war reparations from Germany. Can you think about it? 70 years after the war, and now they thought like they're going to demand war reparations from Germany. Obviously, this was just this wasn't serious. This was just to disbalance the society further on. Then and all kinds of stuff like that. Okay, it's outrage after outrage after outrage, and like an impossible idea one after another. And unfortunately, what it produces is that the society is disintegrated to an extent because of the aggressiveness, because of the hooliganism that there are people. It is translated in society into some form of tribalism, I would say. Like especially when you ask the people who take active interest in public cause, then it's like you either support law and justice or you support the civic platform, which is the leader of the opposition. There is no other way. For us, for the left, and we are blamed all the time for the victories of law and justice, for the last 6 victories of law and justice, because we were not, part of the united opposition. Well, it's like blaming vegans for, people who are butchers not selling enough beef. Like, I'm sorry, we are not going to take part in this. Like, we understand that there are significant problems with the civic liberties, with, democracy, if you like, that there are growing authoritarian tendencies, and so on and so forth. But we are not going to support a project that, the bottom line of which is let's go back to how it has been before law and justice, because this means let's go back to how it has been, how the circumstances were that gave us law and justice. So let's go back into the old status quo that produced the victory of law and justice, and we're not going to sign up to that.
But in Poland, which is quite different than the United States, you do have some kind of representation based on proportionality, don't you? It's not just first past the post. So the left actually gets some seats because of this. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. The left has been very weak for a long period of time now. It had a moment when it could have gotten everything, but due to the kind of neoliberal orientation of the government, it was 20 years ago, so it's history now. But yeah, we do have some MPs. Like out of 364, we have like almost 41 left MPs. So yes, of course, we do have that representation. But this representation doesn't really mean much when you have the overwhelming majority of law and justice, a very solid, a very disciplined one, okay, in front, like they can do whatever they like. And, our MPs, even on the streets, even on the streets, it's difficult for them to intervene because the police is now allowed to actually beat them up.
Right. Now, who owns stuff in Poland? How concentrated is the ownership of the economy? What is the sort of class structure and levels of inequality? But mostly, who owns stuff? Because right now we've been talking about political parties and political, but where's the real power?
So the real power. Well, it's not like in America where the real power almost doesn't lie with the executive branch. Okay, it's like we don't have that sort of oligarchic, bureaucratic, deep state behind the scenes, not to the extent at least. Okay, as you have in America. Of course, there are families and people who are extremely, wealthy, the kind of filthy rich of Poland. Of course, they are there, but and they are in constant contact with the representatives of all political parties, basically, because for them, if it's going to be whatever, a fundamentalist Catholic state, run in an authoritarian manner, or some kind of conservative conservative regime, but with better functioning democracy than we have now. For them it doesn't matter so much. So we have a couple of families, like maybe 10 together.
Yeah, I'm reading on the Forbes list. There's 6 Polish billionaires.
Okay, yeah, right. So these 6 Polish billionaires plus I'd like say 4 or 5 other people who are not billionaires, but they have a lot of. Well, basically an infinite amount of money because you can't really spend that, and you get a sense of it. But also, I think it's important to figure out to maybe to look at it in retrospect how these fortunes were formed, because they were formed only on the basis of stealing what has been produced, built, and established by the People's Republic until 1989. Then it was privatized. Privatized in a way it was like given for pennies, to people. And there were in the 90s we had a scandal after a scandal for how for single cents, factories were sold to individual people. How for example, large areas, large rural area, large agricultural areas were sold, also to the church. By the way, also to the church, and it's important. The message that I'm trying to convey is that these are not people who have worked hard, invested well, then managed their companies, and so on and so forth. No, that's not the case. We don't have that kind of bourgeoisie, let's use it in Marxist jargon, okay? We just have people who, had they been thrown in the beginning of the 90s into any kind of market conditions, they wouldn't have lasted for 5 minutes because they had no idea. They had been given large resources as a present almost, and then, some of them managed to build up on that, and some of them Some of them failed utterly. And, many of these assets, like factories and so on and so forth, were also sold to international companies, which afterwards closed them down in order not to, to prevent competition. So it's the inequalities, statistically speaking, are terrible. We are, like Bulgaria is always first. It's the poorest country in the European Union. Then comes Romania, and then it's Poland. And it's always been like that since 2004, since Poland joined the European Union, or 2007 really, because it's Romania and Bulgaria that joined on that year. But between 2004 and 2007, Poland was the poorest and with biggest income gap and inequalities. So that's a very, very severe problem. And now, because of the mild social measures that Law and Justice have introduced, this was supposed to, to get balanced a little bit. But you see, the structure of the economy, the overall architecture of how the Polish economy functions, which was designed, was designed earlier, but was imposed on Poland in 1989, is such that even despite these child support, and other minor social measures introduced by Law and Justice, the poverty is growing, including the so-called extreme poverty. Okay, so as I said, what we are witnessing is an end of a model because people just can't take it anymore. And I'd like to be hopeful, but I'm not very optimistic. I'm not sure what's coming is much better.
I guess that's the feeling all around the world right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much for joining us. And let's do this again soon, because you keep using the term so-called communism. I think we could do a whole segment on what you mean by that.
Absolutely. Gladly. Yeah.
So let's arrange that soon. So Boyan, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for joining us on the theAnalysis.news podcast.